This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us for the third webinar in our June webinar series, Why Every Business Needs a Continuity Plan to Protect its Revenue. My name is Leah Steele. I'm the Economic Development Coordinator for the City of Laurel, and we're the sponsor for this webinar series. Before we get started, just a few notes. Please mute your microphones. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the chat box on the right of your screen. I'll be monitoring that for questions throughout the presentation. And then if you want to right now, you can type in your business type or industry into the chat box so we can get to know you a little bit better. We're going to be recording this webinar, so you'll be able to see it either tonight or tomorrow on our Facebook page, facebook.com/LaurelECD. I posted that link in the chat box as well. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, a local author with over 10 years experience helping small businesses and entrepreneurs. Farah Kami, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Leah. Welcome to Why Every Small Business Needs a Continuity Plan to Protect its Revenue. Before we begin, as always, I'd like to thank the City of Laurel's Economic and Community Development Department for hosting this webinar, specifically Leah Steele for organizing everything. And of course, as always, I'd like to thank all those essential workers that we don't normally think of as essential, but have proven to be very essential for our way of life. Just a brief intro to this series of COVID-19 pandemic business webinars. There are 3 of them, and I'll go through them. I just wanted to say that they are cumulative in content, so one builds off of another. This presentation today does build off of the last one we did. And of course, the last one was pivoting revenue streams right now and re-strategizing for the future. Today, we're doing why every small business needs a continuity plan to protect its revenue. And next week, I'll be doing the lecture on marketing is more than just advertising, specifically tying it to things in the going on with small business and the pandemic. And of course, as always, if you would like to see any specific type of webinar, any specific type of content, please feel free to reach out to me or Leah Steele directly so we can try and organize that for you. I briefly want to review some of the content from the last presentation because it does build on it. So specifically around strategizing for the future and being upfront and saying, as always, I say in every presentation, the type of content we're presenting does not mean or does not claim that if you follow it, it's going to be easy or simple. However, we do try to provide you as many of the tools necessary to try to make it as simple as possible. But obviously, we're going through some hard period and times in our history, and it's not going to be easy to get through it, but we can. One of the things we covered last seminar was specifically on doing situational awareness and assessment, understanding what's going on around you to be able to react. One specific thing we talked about doing a SWOT analysis, and rather than a SWOT, doing a TWSO, basically identifying the threats and weaknesses first, and then the strengths and opportunities. We also talked about the specific threats, and I will tie this back into continuity planning specifically for the pandemic. But the 4 major threats we identified to small business currently are social distancing, staff getting sick, consumer confidence, and then fear and anxiety. So all those 4 threats are essential in addressing in any type of continuity plan. And of course, we talked about weaknesses of a small business. You know, typically small businesses have low cash flow, have less access to credit than a big business, and importantly, small businesses typically do not have backup plans like a business continuity plan. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why they don't. Strengths of small businesses, these are not to be ignored, but obviously small businesses, because they are small, they tend to be more agile than larger businesses. You have smaller staff to worry about. One good thing is that there are only 1 or 2 decision makers with small businesses, so you don't need to go through endless committees or approvals from different chains of authority. You might be a small business that's essential, considered an essential business, and you might also be a small business that has wanted goods and services, even though we're going through economic downturns. Specific opportunities we discussed for small businesses currently. Obviously, if you're an essential business, that's an opportunity right now. If you have the ability to become an essential business, that's also an opportunity. We discussed the Made in the USA movement. That's already started and will likely continue to ramp up. We talked about some opportunities of taking advantage of some government assistance, loans and grants. And of course, if you do a search or watch the presentation from last week, you'll see a list of goods and services that have actually spiked in demand since the start of the pandemic. So continuity planning. Let's talk about what it is and why you should have it for your small business. I do want to say COOP, BCP. So COOP stands for Continuity of Operations Planning, and BCP is Business Continuity Planning or Plan. For this presentation, they're generally interchangeable when we use them. COOP is generally the process that you follow to formulate your business continuity plan. So what is the purpose of a business continuity plan? One, to facilitate the resumption of critical operations, functions, and technology. Two, to do so in a timely and organized manner. And then three, to basically ensure the safety and well-being of employees and customers and guests. Now, all these, I'm sure, as a small business going through the pandemic, kind of ring true to your experience. Facilitating the resumption of critical operations. That is when, the lockdown went into effect and the government said certain types of business absolutely have to be closed. That requires significant planning and preparation to be able to resume. Now, that's when number two comes into play, the timely and organized manner in which we reorganize and resume operations. Eventually, every business, regardless of how long they have stopped working or ceased operations, can get back into business. Whether it's in a timely fashion requires a lot of planning ahead of time. And of course, again, as comes into the pandemic, ensuring the safety and well-being of employees, customers, and guests, obviously. So taking an example of a retail shop, significant amount of retail shops in our area and around the country had to halt operations. And then as they were allowed to reopen, there are significant limitations on what they can do. So they have to consider ahead of time what those limitations will be and try to plan to address it once they're open. Some seamstress shops, if you were forced to close because of the pandemic or because of any other type of event, let's say a fire, you likely had to pre-plan on other locations where you could perform operations. And that could be in a home, it could be in an alternate facility that is exactly like your primary facility. We'll talk about all that as far as it comes to business continuity plans. And then barbershops, that's another business I'll try and talk about. I'm trying to kind of give different examples of businesses, but barbershops obviously saw a significant amount of their revenue, almost 100% in some points, decline because they weren't allowed to open, they weren't allowed to see customers. What types of actions can be taken ahead of time or planned for to try to mitigate those damages? And then the objective of a business continuity plan. One is to maintain critical business functions. Two is to ensure employees are able to access some sort of an alternate facility. And three is to protect vital records. Now, number one, critical business functions, especially when it comes to this presentation, those are basically the business functions that ultimately end up deciding whether you make money or not. So this is really when protecting your revenue comes to place. And then ensuring employees are able to access some sort of facility. So for some, like an accounting firm or a legal firm, any type of firm that provides services, that alternate facility doesn't necessarily have to be another office space that's similar to the one you're working in right now. As has been demonstrated, remote working, enabling remote workers to work from home is also a significant type of alternate facility. And then protecting vital records. So we'll actually talk about what vital records include, but a good example of that is a property manager. Property managers rely on quite a lot of different types of documents, from inspection documents to rental agreements, lease agreements, mortgage agreements, all types of different things that are considered very vital to their daily business. They may reference those documents on a daily basis. However, if for some reason the property management company is not able to access their offices anymore, how are they going to ensure that access to those vital records are still maintained, and they could do so if they work from another facility or work from home? And then restaurants. So critical business functions of a restaurant. We've seen this a lot with the pandemic, and it can be with other types of hazards as well. We'll discuss. But if a restaurant cannot serve in the restaurant anymore, what are they going to do? The components of a COOP, continuity of operations planning, all of these are components: risk assessment, critical business functions, plan activation, internal and external communications, alternate facilities, which we touched on just a little bit. And you'll see like orders of succession, deactivation, employee contact list, vendor contact list, family emergency plan, insurance considerations. For this presentation, I don't want to overload you. So we're only talking about risk assessment and critical business functions. And if you can understand and learn to start your risk assessment and identify your critical business functions, you're going to be in a very good position to take advantage of what a COOP or BCP has to offer. Specifically, and I often have to convince a lot of small business owners and leaders to invest the time to creating a business continuity plan. I assume that now, because everyone has experienced this pandemic, it's going to be one of those things that's going to be a little bit of an easier convincing. But a COOP helps you with several different things. One is addressing loss of access. So this is access by employees, owners, customers, vendors to the business, the location of the business. This can be caused by a series of events. It could be caused by fire, a storm, flooding, riots, and of course a pandemic. There's also loss of services from the workforce. If all of a sudden, and again, we list pandemic and even a recession, if your workforce cannot get to work, that is a problem. If employees are sick in large numbers, they can't get to work, that's a problem. That's something that needs to be addressed and planned for ahead of time. And then loss of services from equipment and systems. So one of the things that a lot of current business continuity plans address is this last thing, and not necessarily the first two: loss of services from equipment or systems. So a lot of IT systems failures or hackings. Let's say a company servers go down, and that has to be addressed. There have to be backup implementations. And then electrical failure. Let's just say the power goes out for an hour. It might not be a big deal to some businesses, but having your power out for an hour, 2 hours, 10 hours, that could be a significant issue. And then, of course, there are other utilities types of failures. So loss of access, loss of services, those are the types of things that a COOP helps address. The importance of having a continuity plan. So even a slight disruption in normal business operations can cause you revenue loss. If it's a restaurant and they're only out for 3 to 4 hours, that may be during a time of day when they're most busy. Let's say busiest time of the year for a restaurant, let's say Mother's Day. If all of a sudden something happens to disrupt operations during that day, you do end up losing a significant amount of revenue. Obviously, the same goes for a pandemic, which is a long-term event. So again, planning, continuity of operations, very important. What I like to say is the COOP addresses the threats and weaknesses of a small business. The threats and weaknesses we specifically went over, especially from the last presentation, and it addresses the weaknesses and threats with the business's own strengths and opportunities. So we're gonna figure out, just like we did with the last seminar, how do we take advantage of our own strengths and then the opportunities available to address those weaknesses and those threats. Planning ahead is always a good idea. I personally am someone who plans a lot and plans ahead and thinks about what could happen in the future. Some of you may share that trait, but generally the saying goes, it's better to have than not need, than to need and not have. So it's better to have the plan and never use it than all of a sudden need it. And then the other important thing of having a continuity plan is that it's really a minimal investment. So what detractors say, reasons why small business owners put off creating, in my experience, a lot of small business owners think it's only for big businesses, a continuity plan. They say that they'll do it, but there's no time right now. Or they may think that it's too complicated and they can't do it on their own, or they can't afford to pay someone to help them do it. And some people just generally feel that nothing that bad will ever happen that they need to plan for. Anything that comes up, they can address immediately. Obviously, what I do want to say up front is that it's not as complicated as you may think it is. A lot of things are complicated when you don't have a framework for them or when you've never done them before. But hopefully after seeing this presentation, and then if you like asking questions and then contacting me for further questions, you'll realize that starting your business continuity plan is really not as difficult as you may have thought before. The first step in business continuity planning is risk assessment. That's one of the things we'll cover somewhat in depth in this presentation. The risk assessment really is comprised of 5 different things. Pretty easy. If you've been doing your business for even a year, maybe even less, you should have no problem figuring out what goes into this. And what basically this table shows is a point system where you list a hazard, and then you identify the probability that it'll happen, the magnitude it can have, the warning timeline that you can have, and then how long it'll last. And there's 16 points possible in this type of assessment. And obviously, the higher the score, the more likely it is to happen and the more likely it is to have a negative impact. And so obviously, if something is, as close to 16 points, that's the one you want to address first. Just as an example, I've listed 3 relatively common hazards that are identified. Now, I will note pandemic, while that did appear on several good continuity plans in the past, usually it was just a small influenza pandemic, which had an impact of about a week or 2. So we're really learning about the timeline of pandemics and how severe they can be and how long it actually takes for us to address their disruptions. But taking a simple one like an electrical hazard, let's just say that you lose power in your facility. Now, the probability of that happening, that likely rests on the amount of times that's occurred before. So if it's something that continuously happens every week, it's going to be a highly likely event that it's going to continue. If it sometimes happens, maybe once every 3 months or so, it's likely to happen. If it has happened once in the year, sure. You can put a number 2, possible. And then if it has almost never happened, you never want to put 0 because anything can happen. But you want to put a 1 as it is unlikely to happen. So magnitude. This is somewhat open to an interpretation, especially depending on the type of business that you have. So if I'm in, a barber shop during the day, Electrical failure may not be as catastrophic as it is to a restaurant or any type of business that requires refrigeration, something like that. So again, you go down, and for this one, let's just assume it's something like a restaurant, and I put a number, a 3-pointer, a critical. Could also be limited or negligible. The warning. Now, the warning is a timeline of how quickly you'll have advanced warning that this event is going to take place. So for an electrical event, you'll likely get 0 warning whatsoever. I've never gotten a phone call right before I'm about to lose power to say that I'm losing power. So those timelines can be adjusted, but what I've listed there is generally the types of warning timelines that you'll consider. And then duration, very important. How long does this event typically last? Because the longer it lasts, the more critical it's going to be, and it actually has the potential to be catastrophic. So for an electrical event, we put 3 to 6 hours. It could be less than 3 hours. Again, it depends on your experience, on where your business is located, and how, in the past, how long it's taken for electrical service to be restored. A pandemic, obviously, we're going to use that as an example here. The probability of that happening, highly likely, right? It's almost an epidemic happens almost every year, like the flu epidemic or flu pandemic. So we know that it's going to happen. Typically, it's been confined more so to a season, but now we're finding that it's very likely, either likely or highly likely, that we'll see a pandemic in months where we typically don't see them. And because of what's going on with the new viruses, it could happen more frequently. And I do stress the pandemic, and I do repeat pandemic examples throughout this. One reason is that we are predicting that there will be a resurgence of this pandemic potentially in September, October timeframe. So it really is important to consider that hazard of a pandemic to be able to start to plan to address and mitigate the effects of it should it have a resurgence in September, October timeframe. Again, magnitude. This depends on your business right now, but you should have no problem figuring out what the magnitude of an impact of a pandemic is. I put critical 3, but for some businesses, it can be catastrophic. If you were not able to open your business for 3 months and it relies 100% on in-person customer interaction, then that has catastrophic consequences. And then there's the warning time frame. So the one good thing we have for a pandemic is that we do get more than a 1-day notice, probably a week's notice, maybe even longer, to have that alarm going off in our head that, hey, the potential of a pandemic is coming. So you do have time to react to it, as opposed to an electrical outage where it's almost, you don't know it's happened until it's happened. And then the duration, so these little time slots seem a little bit ridiculous when we're talking about a pandemic, but beyond 12 hours, typically, you want to put a 4, you can adjust those, but it's going to take a long time for us to address the impacts of a pandemic. So if you see the total, 12 out of 16 points. And really the redeeming score there is, the amount of warning time that we have. So if we're planning for the resurgence potentially for September, October, we have several months of planning. And then there's flooding, a common example. This really does depend on where your business is located. It could be natural flooding, it could be flooding from a burst pipe. But if this has never happened, if you are not in a floodplain, then it's probably unlikely that it's going to happen. Now, for those businesses familiar or located in Maryland, if you're a business in Ellicott City's Main Street, the probability of flooding and catastrophic flooding is pretty serious. So the score, depending on where your business is located, is going to change. Again, magnitude, warning, typically flooding, maybe you'll have, if you've experienced it before in the same location, maybe 1 hour, maybe 30 minutes. Again, that's not something that that you can really rely on. National Weather Service does put out, thunderstorm, flood warnings, high water warnings, things like that. So if that's something you're constantly worried about, that's information that you need to consider. And then usually flooding, the immediate effects less than 3 hours, the post effects, it could last up to days. So for this business, identifying those 3 hazards, obviously pandemic as the highest one, electrical, and then flooding. So some other hazards that you might want to consider, and this isn't a list of all hazards that you could face. And as you can see, there are certain hazards that, again, depending on location, you don't necessarily have to worry about so much. So if you're not in a coastal plain or, certain, I don't know if anyone in the United States has to really worry about tsunamis, but it is a hazard event. So hurricane, tsunami, tropical storms, thunderstorms, lightning, hail, tornado, depending on where you're located. Every business, especially in our area, should have some kind of continuity plan for snow and ice storms, because we will get them, even though they may not be catastrophic. High winds, depending on locations. Again, wildfire, regular fire, structural fire, landslides, earthquakes, the electrical grid going out. That is a potential hazard. Terrorism, theft, robbery, rioting, all those types at some point, most of these have to be somewhat addressed on your continuity plan. The second part of the business continuity plan is both identifying and really getting to know your critical business functions. These are functions and critical activities that basically sustain your mission. And typically your mission is to fulfill blank, but your mission is also to make money. So anything that impacts your activities to make money is a critical business function. And if you take out the critical business function, then your revenue stream stops. So these are 2 different types of functions, line functions and support functions. Line functions are basically your direct activity on the product that makes you money, product or service. So a barbershop, cutting hair is their line function. For a massage therapist, providing massage is their line function. Seamstress, actually sewing, that's their line functions. And then we have support functions. Support functions are paying employees, making sure your servers are working or your laptops are working or your equipment is working, specific to those. More examples like intake of hired people, keeping servers up, receiving supplies. So if you're a restaurant and you need to take in inventory like canned goods or meat, or you need to go shop for those supplies, those are critical support functions, because without those, you can't make money, you can't perform your line function. They are the backbone of your business. Basically, if you take them out, your business stops. And of course, they must be continued for revenue and mission. And process and functions, not department. So it is not a critical function, is not the HR department or not the finance department. It is actual processes that the finance department or the IT department produces. So finance department cuts paychecks to employees. If paychecks are held up or you can't print paychecks just because you don't have access to checks or money, then that is a critical business function and it will stop your business. I know this table is a little bit small, but there is a worksheet that we use across the industry for continuity planning, and you can modify it as to your needs. But this is the worksheet that is typically used, and I'm happy to send you a template of this worksheet and a full business continuity plan. I'll give you my email at the end of the presentation, and you can feel free to email me and I'll just send that over to you as a template, and basically you can fill it out. But just quickly, this is where you will list your critical business function. You could have 1, you could have 20. It really depends on your business and how well and how detailed you want to be. The business process to complete, this is basically a you know, the instructions or the procedures of what this involves. So if it's cutting paychecks, you'll say, I use QuickBooks to process paychecks every Tuesday of every week or once every 2 weeks, whatever it is. And really, this is for someone else who is not you, who is not the business owner or expert. That's how you should write it. So in case someone else needs to follow the sheet, they won't have to have your level of knowledge. They can have the basic level of knowledge and kind of complete the task. You're going to list your supporting activities, and we'll kind of go through specifically what these mean. But supporting activities, obviously the person of contact for that activity. You're going to list any vendors. If an accountant helps you run payroll every week, you're going to need to list that and their contact information. Then vital records, what do you need to do this task? For payroll purposes, obviously you're going to need your software, or you are going to need whatever you use to figure out how many taxes to withhold and all that stuff. You may need to have access to employee records to do this, especially if you're setting that up new at an alternative facility or at home. And then you're going to consider your maximum allowed downtime. And that determines your criticality. So how long can you go without doing this? So for example, let's say whoever does IT for your company, doing Windows updates on your laptop, it actually may not be as critical for you to do updates for a week or two, but it will be critical to basically print those paychecks for the next time that payroll is due. Implications of not conducted. So let's say people can't come to your business if you're a barbershop. Those implications are pretty serious. You're not going to be doing any business. Calendar dependence. So I do use an accounting firm or a tax prep firm as an example throughout this presentation. Some functions like preparing 2019 income taxes, those are seasonal. So you need to be aware of the calendar dependence of your critical functions as well, because things are way busier typically in an April timeframe now in July than usually. Then let's say August or something like that for tax prep. And then facilities. So if you're lucky enough to be able to do your business in another facility or even from home, then you need to make sure you have ahead of time everything that you need in those facilities to do your to continue your operations without having to go out and buy new things, basically. Supporting partners, and then obviously vital records. Again, you want to list what you need and where you can find it. And supporting partners, again, it could be a lawyer, it could be an accountant, it could be a professional staffing firm that you have on standby just in case to help you. So as I mentioned, we'll go through specifically on some of those line items and talk about them and give some examples. But functions, specific function that may need to be resumed, business process to complete, again, high-level description of the function process, and then supporting activities, tasks performed for each critical. So again, using the payroll example, someone generates the payroll, but then someone else signs them potentially. So those are different tasks that go with those. And I've given several examples of the restaurant, accounting, barbershop. Lead point of contact, that's somewhat self-explanatory. You can't always rely on having your cell phone or, just being able to remember someone's email or phone number. So you have to make sure that that information is available in other places, in hard copy or soft copy on the cloud somewhere where you can access. Hard copy backups are recommended, just in case you have no internet or electrical service where you can access the internet to get on the cloud. Vendors and external contacts, again, same thing. You need to have a list of those POCs and make sure they know that they're a part of your business continuity plan. Good example generally of vital records. So policies and procedures, contracts, memorandums of agreements, Insurance information, very important, and payroll information. Like we said, electronic and hard copy list of staff members and their contact information. And then keys, access codes, passwords. You need to keep these as a backup in some kind of protected format at alternate facilities or somewhere else. Again, cloud, wherever, at your home. And then continuity facility location. So if you are one of those types of businesses that does actually need to have a different facility to resume operations, then you'll probably have to have directions, because this is the type of facility where most people don't think about. They may never think about it for 2-3 years, and then all of a sudden they have to get there and they have no idea how. So if you have a catering business, not necessarily even a restaurant, but if you all of a sudden don't have access to your primary catering facility, your kitchen that you work at, you do need to have some kind of plan to be able to resume your catering operations, your food prep operations at another facility. Now, most small businesses won't be able to maintain 2 different sets of leases for a backup facility, but you could have agreements with another facility, whereas if you lose access to your building, that you can go and use their facilities, or vice versa. So kind of good to team up with companies that provide similar services and try to take advantage of that in your business continuity planning. Maximum allowed downtime, that's formally the amount of time your business could afford for the function to be down before it could cause the business irreparable harm. A barbershop, how long will the barbershop kind of be able to be out of business? Maybe it's a day, maybe it's 5 days. It depends on how much money you set aside. But typically, small businesses don't have a lot of cash flow, so there's not a lot of leeway in the downtime. And then, these are typical considerations for time blocks that are used. But again, you can use whatever you feel as an expert of your business. And then criticality. So this is one of the probably more influential and important aspects of business continuity planning, and specifically the functions. When you think about the function, think about how often does this function occur. The more it occurs, the more critical it is. How many business units perform this function? So how many either employees or departments or staff members are involved with this function? Does the successful completion of this function depend on other functions? So if other departments or other support personnel are needed to fulfill this function, it becomes more critical because more things depend on it. And then are other functions depending on this? So your ability to serve food at a restaurant depends on payroll being processed, your inventory coming in on time, your employees showing up on time and not being sick. So that's really, that becomes a very critical function. So it's high criticality. Is there potential for revenue loss? Most times it will be. Sometimes, let's say if you can't update your computers or you can't have your annual update on your laptops, that may not be as big of a deal. It might not lead to immediate revenue loss. Is there a potential for fines, litigation, additional downtime, or other punishment for non-compliance? So is there a regulatory aspect to this? If you have to turn in a report every month based on what you do, maybe you're in small business for chemical manufacturing or a brewery, if you're not able to produce your reports or pay your tax obligations, is there going to be a bigger problem that's going to result from that? And then does this function directly impact the business's image or market share? So we see this a lot with the pandemic. If the longer you're closed, the more likely it is that customers will forget about you, or someone else might come in and take your market share. Very important. So those are some of the questions, and the template that I can email you if you like will have some more stuff, but I just tried to highlight some of it for the sake of time. Critical business functions required resources. So you do need to identify the resources that are required to fill these critical business functions. One is people, for obvious reasons, equipment, supplies, IT, and then interdependencies. So people, who does this? How many employees does it take? Equipment, required in order to get this function back in operation. Now, this isn't for equipment and supply. This isn't like easy stuff that you can walk into a Staples and just buy. Like you don't need to list staplers, but like, let's say very highly specialized sewing equipment or a forklift or, you know, an industrial refrigerator for your restaurant. Those are important. And then information technology. So if you're the type of business that can do remote work, or you can manage your business from a remote location like home, what software do you need? You know, maybe you have a desktop computer at your workplace that has Microsoft Office on it, but your home computer doesn't have it. So you're going to need to address that. And then obviously there's your financial software. You need to make sure you have access to it. Again, if it's on work computer and let's say a fire or storm event occurred and you have had loss of property, how are you going to access your QuickBooks or your point of sale equipment and software? And then we briefly touched about this, but interdependencies, list other business functions this function relies on in order to do the operation. Again, just implications if not conducted. So you do need to have a good idea of what bad things can happen if these critical functions do not occur. And you need to do that in order to address mitigation strategies, like what you can do. So required sources. How are you going to replace staff, equipment, supplies, IT, and other resources if all of a sudden you lose access to them? If all of a sudden your employees can't come to work, have you identified a place where you can get trained employees? Maybe at a union hall, maybe at a staffing agency that can kind of has the access, or maybe you're constantly sourcing for those types of employees just so you have a database yourself. Facilities, so standard office space, that can be a facility or remote work enabling. And when we talk about remote work, it's not just saying, hey, employee X, Y, and Z, you're able to work from home, right? And they'll say, yes, I can. You have to make sure that they have the proper equipment. You know, you have to make sure they have internet service if they need to work from home. For whatever type of business you're doing, you may need to make sure they have phones, computers, scanners, printers, different types of things, whatever your business is. And then supporting partners, again, listing what supporting partners and making sure that they know they're on your business continuity plan. So what I kind of want to close with is specifically for this pandemic. And I know I've harped on this, and I don't want to make it seem like continuity planning is just for a pandemic. There are plenty of other hazards, but we're trying to keep this as relevant to today as possible. So for this pandemic specifically, you may say, you may still be, you know, someone who thinks that all that work that we just talked about, and it is only 2 sections of 11 sections in a business continuity plan, but maybe that's too complicated. So what you can start with instead is just this simple table. For your business as an exercise, and you should already know this type of information, but for your business, you can list the functions, the critical functions in a business. So for this one in particular, and I've done 3 just as examples, but we've touched on this a little bit also, service in a restaurant. So a restaurant that does service, most of their business here, their implications are 80% of their business is in a restaurant service, where servers come to the table, take your order, and, you know, serve food, you know, you accept payment, all that stuff done in restaurants. So the implications of that stopping is that 80% of your business, let's just say, You're 80% in restaurant, 20% carry out or delivery. 80% is impacted immediately. So you're going to lose 80%. Specifically, the threats of the pandemic that we talked about briefly at the beginning, social distancing, consumer confidence, and then fear and anxiety as it goes on. Those are the threats. You need to figure out your mitigation strategies. And those mitigation strategies that I've listed in general come from the last presentations. Going mobile, going online, being more flexible and nimble, going digital, and using the telephone way more. So those are the mitigation strategies for that specific threat. And then you can list the specific actions. So for a restaurant in particular that loses their facility, 80% of their business, going mobile. So that means starting to deliver food, or going digital or online and taking advantage of delivery apps like Uber Eats, Grubhub, and all the other things. A lot of restaurants didn't have relationships with those digital platforms, and now they do. So those specific things, specific actions will be listed right there as just an exercise to start with your business continuity planning. Even if you don't want to establish those relationships with Uber Eats right now, if you haven't already and you're a restaurant, that's fine. Let's say your business is not impacted. It's okay, but you do need to do research to figure out how you can establish those relationships when and if the time comes where your business operation is halted. And then again, we talked about consumer confidence and fear, anxiety. Those are some of the general mitigation strategies. But let's just say for a restaurant, if you're an in-person restaurant, in-facility restaurant that only accepted cash, you're going to need to find out how and when and how long it takes to get credit card acceptance up and running if all of a sudden you're going to need to rely on taking credit payments. The next example is for a tax preparation, or let's just say accounting firm. Obviously somewhat of a seasonal business, but 29 tax prep season. You will need 90% of your business basically relies on this function, and it is seasonal. So most of your money is made at that time. Let's say that a lot of your customers used to come in person and provide you their documentation and get in-person consultation, and there's a back and forth. But now the threat is from social distancing. You can't do that anymore. You can't have one-on-one meetings. Do you have the platforms available for your customers to be able to send you secure documents, to be able to have secure video conferencing, to talk about those confidential financial information and aspects? So again, you consider those mitigation strategies for your threats, and you can list specific items that you need to take, again, as a starter. Same thing with consumer confidence. Maybe people had to pay ahead of time for your tax prep services, and now you can wait till the refund comes in, things like that. And then another example, barbershop. So their line function is cutting hair. Many of the barbershops didn't have any type of backup plan. So if customers are not able to come to the barbershop, 100% of business revenue was disrupted. How long could a business go with 100% of its revenue interrupted? The threats, again, came from social distancing primarily and first. So what backup plans can you put in place? Can you provide mobile one-on-one services, considering you're going to wear PPE and maybe you'll cut hair outside? How are you going to reach customers? What type of appointment scheduling will you have once some of the restrictions are eased? All that stuff needs to be planned for, especially if there is a resurgence right now. And what I'm going to do is stop kind of right here and see if there are any questions. Again, this is my contact information. You can feel free to email me. This isn't the type of subject where you can just watch or listen to someone talk about and then know how to do. Um, Using these types of, plain and simple worksheets is a good idea to get yourself familiar with the concepts, and then more than happy to send you best practice templates at no cost so you can actually start reading through some business continuity plans and filling it out for your own business. But the big thing I do want to stress is that there is high potential, high likelihood of a resurgence of the pandemic. And because we've all experienced it and we have some familiarity, it is very important. So we have plenty of time to prepare, and have those backup processes in place just in case it does happen. So I can stop here. If there are any questions, great, happy to answer them. If not, as Leah stated, this presentation is being recorded and it will be up online, so you can continue to watch it, watch the one from before and watch the one after this one. And at any point, feel free to contact me via email. I'm on LinkedIn. You should just be able to search for my name. I have a public profile, and then on Amazon, my book is listed, Startup King in digital and paperback. And there are some continuity tips in there as well, and more checklists for starting and maintaining a business. So with that, I will pass it back on to Leah.
Thank you, Bear, so much. I'll be posting the link to watch this webinar on our Facebook page, facebook.com/LaurelECD. Thank you, everyone, for attending.